Okay, we got a signal that we could start our session for today. I'd like to welcome you to the last meeting, no, not the totally last meeting, but our last Alexander von Humboldt event in this series on spatial practices. I also would like to welcome our guest for today, Professor Sarah Whatmore, from the School of Geography and Environment at Oxford University. If you look at her website, she makes a very clear description of what she is up to, also for today, I think. There she writes, her research is focused on the relations between people and the material world. And this relationship, of course, has always been very fundamental and central for human geography as a discipline. But somehow also this focus on this relationship has shifted a little bit to the background in our discipline. When human geography started embracing constructivism, both in action theoretical as well as in post-structuralist terms. But the issue never totally disappeared and actually was readdressed under the influence of feminist geographical thinking as well as neo-structuralists, including some fashions of post-structuralist thinking, resulting in many different modes of relational approaches, or, as in this Alexander von Humboldt series, in practice theoretical kind of approach. And this kind of more than just human ways of thinking made Professor Sarah Whatmore famous, I believe, and also highly topical for our series. In addition, Sarah Whatmore is not just interested in more than human practices in general, but also, more specifically, in practices of scientific inquiry and practices of governance in particular, where she asks how politics actually changes if we take the materiality of our situation seriously. This makes her story of utmost relevance for our daily work as academic researchers and as policy advisors. And this latter interest of her is also exemplified in her work, in her latest work in relation to flood risks management. And do not tell a Dutch person how relevant flood risks are, but also environmental risk management in more general terms. And this led her to a number of different book publications by her hand, of which I can only show a few. Sorry. Yeah, we had this problem before, huh? Okay. Oh, too far again. Oh, come on. There we are. Okay. These are a number of books which are important for her research interest. Political Matter, Technoscience, Democracy and Public Life, which is actually in press right now. Hybrid Geographies, probably one of her best known books, but also Using Social Theory, and of course also her contribution to the Dictionary of Human Geography. But as I say, I think it is not so worthwhile listening to me. It's much more worthwhile to listen to her, so I'll give the floor to her. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now if I... okay, just adjust. I'm going to be very loud. How loud am I? I'm resounding and echoing to myself, but can you hear me at the back? Great, okay. And thank you, guys up there, for putting the next slides on. I'd like to thank, first of all, the university and particularly Professor Ernste for the invitation to give this lecture today. It's a great honour, and looking at the list of who has been speaking in this series on spatial practices, that is redoubled. So what I want to try to do today is to cover a particular area of post-structuralist theory, which has been taken up very actively. Indeed, I would probably even go so far as to argue geographers have been one of the pioneers in this body of theory, usually going under the label of post-humanism, but as the title suggests, and as I will explain in the introductory elements of this lecture, I prefer to use the signature of the more than human. And Professor Ernste has already given, I think, quite a good sense of what we might, the kinds of ground that we might be covering. Ooh. Okay, I think I now have the measure of this device. How much thumb pressure should one apply? Okay, so this is really going back some way. At least the title of this slide goes back to the title of a chapter that I was asked to write for a book that Doreen Massey and some of her colleagues at the Open University edited way back now. This is going to date me in 1999. My chapter was called The Rethinking the Human in Human Geography, and the title of the book was supposed to be a sort of summative survey of human geography at the end of that decade. It was called Human Geography Today. And some of the themes that I was asked to address then have been, as it were, key themes that I've pursued since then under this term of the more than human. This is actually a quote from an English literary theorist who is writing about his own encounter with one of the key thinkers in this body of work, certainly a particularly influential thinker in my own take on this body of work, and geographers' take more broadly, that is Isabel Stengers. So this is William Paulson drawing some conclusions from his encounter or engagement with the work of Isabel Stengers. It is not, he suggests, enough to decide to include non-humans in collectives, or to acknowledge that societies live in a physical and biological world, as useful as these steps may be. The crucial point is to learn how new types of encounter and conviviality, a key term for him and indeed for Stengers, with non-humans, which emerge in the practice of the sciences over the course of their history, can give rise to new modes of relation with humans, i.e. new political practices. And what he's drawing our attention to here is that front and centre of this post-humanist, so-called post-humanist current in post-structuralist theory is a combination, a rather unlikely combination on first sight, between what we do in thinking about the larger material world and our connections to it, and the political consequences of taking that larger material world more seriously. So a connection then between the non-human and the political. So the current of thinking that I want to talk about, and it's one that I almost seem to get monthly requests to produce something or have things reproduced in books, from architecture and planning on the one end to anthropology and literature on the other end. It seems to have been a term that's gained huge traction, particularly in fields of cultural studies, but also, I'll argue, in geography. Post-humanism, what are we talking about? And that is a complicated question, and of course I'm not going to be able to do justice to it here. But I want to give you some kind of a sense of how post-humanism is used by way of background to why I use something entirely different, that is, the more than human. So humanism, then, is a discourse which claims the figure of man naturally stands at the centre of things, is entirely distinct from animals, machines, and other non-human entities, is absolutely known and knowable to himself, the origin of meaning and history, and shares with all other human beings a universal essence. That, if you like, is the definition of what post-humanism opposes itself to. But of course the story is more complex than that. And with all the other posts that have gone before, there are huge difficulties with the use of this term. If we examine some of the currents at work in moves against this humanist legacy, as it applies to the importance of thinking through our relationships with the material world, we can see at least three different currents in play. So the notion of post-humanism, then, is not singular. There are many different currents at work in different disciplines. Sometimes they're used as if they mean the same thing, but actually they're quite different. It's very sensitive, this thing, isn't it? Just leave it there. It is going to stay on. Okay, so I'm going to pull out just three different currents in this post-humanist body of thought. The first and possibly the best known in that it has been used by one of the most influential thinkers of the late 20th century, Francis Fukuyama, in the sense that I have least sympathy with, as indeed do most other people writing in this vein. But he writes about post-humanism as a kind of crisis in humanity, a crisis brought about by our own technical capacities to modify ourselves through various kinds of genetic engineering techniques and so on. So here, this current of thinking in post-humanism is seen, as it were, as a kind of incipient historical condition. For the first time in our history, we can remake ourselves in profound ways, and this, for Fukuyama, is deeply disturbing. A second and more well-known usage, particularly in the humanities, is the usage that is often attributed to writers like Jacques Derrida and Giorgio Agamben, which, as in the tradition of the humanities, is much more concerned about the need for constant deconstructive vigilance. That is, vigilance over the way in which the idea or the figure of the human, usually represented by man, is actually deployed politically and in philosophy. So it's part of that rigour, if you like, that attentiveness to how and why arguments that depend on deploying the notion of man or the human to make its arguments, what it is that they're doing, just what's wrapped up in that term, and what it means for the kinds of political constructions that are based upon it. And then the third current in post-humanism, and the one that I'm going to spend most time working with today, it's the current, I guess, with which my own work, but that of a whole series of geographers, has become most closely associated. But it can also be identified, for example, in the work of anthropologists like Donna Haraway, her Simian Cyborgs and Women book from back in the early 90s, right through to probably its most prolific proponent today, Carrie Wolf, and his various book-length explanations of post-humanism. Where we might term these kinds of approaches, to use a term that Donna Haraway herself coined, of a kind of ontological choreography. That is, it's a current of work that's much more concerned with the remaking in the material sense of remaking, not just the linguistic sense, not just the figurative sense, but in the material sense of remaking of the relationships between human, body and ecology. And implicit in that series of slashes that divide those words is the idea that the boundaries between those things are highly fluid. In other words, rather than taking the human or the body or ecology as already constituted things that we can apprehend and take hold of readily as if they were already existing units in the world, unchanging units that we can rely upon, these are all things that are in the making. And they are in the making constantly through their relationships, above all, to one another. So it's on that third current in post-humanist thinking, then, that I want to map some of the work in contemporary human geography as one of the main contributors to this current of work. So I'll translate that third current, then, into this alternative term, or alternative way of coming at this sort of set of concerns, the more than human. So rather than being something, as it were, after the human, or even after humanism, we're thinking much more in terms of what is in excess of the human, or what is in excess of humanism, what is left out, and what is the importance of what is left out for how the category of the human and our own social lives are actually built and made and in the process of being made. One of the early theorists in geography who took up some of these ideas, whose work some of you may be familiar with, was John Murdoch, now sadly very early deceased, in his book Post-structuralist Geography that came out just before his death in 2006. And this is a quote from John's book. In his, what he was trying to argue was important about this current of thinking for the project of geography. Heterogeneity, he says, the mingling of various quality entities in complex assemblages, networks, and or systems might now comprise geography's main intellectual concern. And so it is that we tie this notion of the more than human immediately to your theme of spatial practices. In thinking about how the human gets made and remade in relation to other kinds and wider ecologies through the histories of time, we need to be thinking about these various sorts of notions for grasping at the ways in which we are interconnected. Assemblages, networks, or systems are just some of the vocabularies that have been elaborated in different kinds of approaches to think through that connectivity. Okay, now before I get to some applied examples of what are some fairly abstract sets of ideas, quite complicated sets of ideas, for those, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with them, but for those who aren't, I just want very briefly to pull out for you some of the sorts of influences, intellectual influences, but also the sorts of political urgencies that attach to this more than human agenda. The first of these I would call the ontological turn. I know you looked at something called the practice turn. Everyone's always turning. Indeed, there was a spatial turn not so very long ago, when allegedly lots of other disciplines were suddenly discovering geography and the importance of space and time. The ontological turn in philosophy and social theory, and I've listed here some of the more influential thinkers, I think some of whom you will well have come across in earlier lectures in this series. So certainly Gilles Deleuze and his collaborator Guattari, Michel Serres, Isabel Stengers, the political theorist Jane Bennett, Bruno Latour, and Nigel Thrift in geography are probably some of the better known names. The idea of the ontological turn, if the practice turn, I'm sure has been explained much better than I'm going to be able to, my brief allusion to it here today, if the practice turn is a turn, as it were, away from imagining that human interrelations and human social activities are mediated primarily by language or discourses, and are rather mediated by a whole host of different things which we can think of as practices, including language itself. The ontological turn in philosophy and social theory has been a turn away from thinking that the primary question, or the primary problem that we have to address, is an epistemological one. How do we know? Which gets us into that constant recursive loop of reflexivity. What are the nature of our questions? What is the nature of knowledge, etc., etc. Towards a central interest in the question of how does the world make itself known? What are the kinds of things in the world? What are their powers and forces? And how do they make their presence felt in our everyday lives, political structures, economic arrangements, and so on? I guess a second kind of influence that we might think about is the rise of what I'd call disciplinary in-betweens and research collaborations. That's rather a lot of terms to avoid using the notion of interdisciplinarity. I think interdisciplinarity, or indeed multidisciplinarity, has become so loaded now, it's almost impossible to use it without a whole bunch of baggage being brought in to the game. So I'm just using the notion of interdisciplinary in-betweens. I think if you look at the kinds of other sources of inspiration and thinking on which geographers both rely and feed into, in other words, the kinds of fields of knowledge that geography is in conversation with at particular points in time, I would argue that human geography for the last 10 to 15 years, say, has increasingly found itself in conversation with a whole series, not of standard disciplines, like anthropology and archaeology, going right back to the 19th century origins of geography, for example, but rather to these in-between spaces. So the rise, for example, of science and technology studies, or STS, of performance studies at the humanities wing, or of animal studies in a whole variety of contexts, bringing together the natural and social sciences in that context. These have been some of our primary interlocutors, the areas of study with which we're having very active conversations, and I would argue which recognise the contribution of geographers to pushing forward thinking in these areas. And then thirdly, and here I'm thinking much more in terms of the sorts of political urgencies and attachments that these ideas circulate through, and hence gain a kind of power in the wider public realm. The rise of what we might think of as knowledge controversies. In Europe, perhaps, we're one of the most intense spots for these kinds of controversies and their importance in political life today, from food scares and environmental risks to biotechnologies and so on through. The idea that scientific knowledge, whether that's in the kinds of technologies that it puts into the world, the sorts of devices which we all now live by, mobile phones, nanotechnology, or whether it's the knowledge claims that underpin those kinds of technologies and devices that we live with, have become key matters of public controversy, key kinds of political tipping points in the public realm. And this, I think, is a third dimension of why post-humanism, or as I would put it, more than human concerns, have gained traction not just in academia, but in the wider political realm. So I tried to suggest in a piece back in 2004, what gives the more than human moment some kind of bite or purchase, rather than simply a set of abstract debates, is the fact that mapping its emergence at the feverish borders of animal, machine, social, material, flesh, information, cultural, natural, all these sorts of binaries that are so important in the way we organise our thinking, is a diffuse activity. It is practiced as much in everyday negotiations with, say, foodstuffs, air quality, and healthcare, as in the generative spatial metaphors of the humanities or the biocomputational models of the life sciences. So the realm of politics, then, I would argue, is as generative of more than human agendas, are either the biosciences, their traditional derivation, or the interest of the humanities in this post-human moment. So what difference does any of this make to the way in which we practice social research, or more particularly for today's audience, more than human geographies? I want to argue that it focuses our attention on three kinds of things. Of course, it does much more than that, but for the purposes of a lecture on this scale, I'm going to focus on four things. And then what I want to do for the rest of the lecture is to work those things through three applied examples of research, geographical research in practice, to try to illustrate what difference these kinds of currents of thought make to the way in which we actually do geography, what it is that we study and how we study it. So the first difference I'm going to be suggesting that it makes, and of course this isn't to say it is exclusive in doing these things, it finds itself bouncing up against a number of other kinds of currents of thought, but I think it's the bringing of these three together which is perhaps particular to this kind of approach. So the first then is what I've called amplifying corporeality, or more particularly, given what I've said so far, intercorporeality, the interconnectedness, the fluidity of bodies, not just our bodies between different people, but the bodies of human bodies and those of other kinds within Earth. And this has led to a number of developments, particularly methodological developments, in the way in which geographical research has come to be practiced. If we think about bodily activities, and particularly the notion that we don't just think with the grey matter in there, Poirot, we actually think with our whole bodies. And we can think about neuroscientific developments that show us that very often when we think we touch something, rather than the usual sociological account that our brain has told our finger that we've touched something, it actually works the other way around. Our finger tells the brain. So in order to get at those kinds of bodily activities, practices, capacities and relationships, one of the new areas of methodological practices that has evolved and is still very much in development is the use of visual methods. And there are different ways of thinking about this, which I'll try to illustrate through the examples that I'm going to go into in a moment. But certainly the development of the use not just of photography, but in particular the use of camcorders, auto recording amongst research subjects, for example, as well as a larger category of activities that I've called here thinking with things. And again, I'll illustrate that. But the basic idea is that if we look at the ways in which we apprehend the world, we learn about the world, and we put the knowledge acquired into some kind of practice to act upon the world or upon one another, more often than not, that process of knowledge making is mediated, if you like, by a whole series of things. We actually rely on various kinds of material elements to help us to come to know. A second category of things, which is a term that Isabel Stengers has developed, is the notion of mapping into knowledge. It's a notion that also lines up quite well, I think, with Bruno Latour's idea of learning to be affected, or Donna Haraway's notion of responsibility in her work with animals of various kinds, but particularly her dog, KN, if anybody knows her work on with her dog. And it's the idea that just as, for example, not very many of us, I shall speak for myself, I'm sure you're all amazingly well athletes, you've tuned your bodies. Well, the example I was going to give is that if I go and watch, for example, a dance troupe, what they're able, or an acrobatic troupe, what they're able to do with their bodies, I know, allegedly, we had the same kind of category of body, but I can't do any of those things. Just as I can't really tell the difference between an amazing glass of wine and a perfectly all right glass of wine. But there are people who have so trained their bodily capacities and senses that they really can do those things and or tell the difference. And it's that idea that we can actually train by exercise and practice our bodily senses and capacities that is very much a part of what's being developed here. The idea that we need to learn, quite literally, we need to practice the effects of other kinds upon us. We need to tune ourselves in better to the way in which the forces of the world speak to us, to use that term loosely. And thirdly, a category of research activities that I've called here redistributing expertise. So one of the things that Professor Ernst identified in his introduction, and that I think will already be quite strongly apparent from what I've said so far, is that increasingly, not only in our everyday lives, but certainly in our lives as professional researchers, our work with the material world, how we understand it, how we relate to it, how we interact with it and rely upon it, is increasingly mediated by the work of the natural sciences, the technologies that they put into the world, and the knowledge claims that they make about it, and on which we rely as citizens in everyday kinds of contexts, as well as in highly politicised contexts. And one of the key emphases, I think, of the work in this more than human tradition is to try to think about the importance of redistributing that expertise, that knowledge about the world out there, so that rather than having it only mediated by natural scientists, we also reconnect, if you like, with our own ways of apprehending the material world and bring those into play, whether it's into play in doing science, working with scientists in collaborative ways, or whether it's in contesting science in the public realm and trying to inform public policy about environmental and a host of other kinds of matters by the sorts of knowledge that we're able to build for ourselves. So the three examples that I'm going to use to work these themes through are drawn from a series of pieces of collaborative work, some of which I've been involved in and some of which I haven't. First, on urban ecologies. Second, on so-called alternative food networks, and I think I've met some of you who are interested in slow food already. And thirdly, on flood risk expertise. So hopefully these sorts of illustrations will help to make some of the points take root. So turn to the first one, urban ecologies. In urban studies, urban planning, architecture, urban design, all of these sorts of fields of study seem to be at a relative high point from what I can gather in their relationship to actor network theory. One of the key theoretical strands that are associated with more than human approaches. And this is Farias and Bender's account of why that encounter between urban studies and actor network theory seems to have taken off. It's because they suggest that ANT proposes theories, concepts and perspectives developed in the field of science and technology studies, and more specifically ANT, and applies them to urban ecology and urban planning. So there seems to be some notion that there is something translatable here from the methods of ANT and their development in science and technology studies to the field of the urban and all the various professional practitioners who are engaged in designing and making the urban in particular sorts of ways. In a piece of work that I was involved with Steve Hinchliffe, who's now at the University of Exeter, called Habitable Cities, we became particularly interested in the way in which spaces that are usually labelled as the urban green become green. What makes them green? That seems like a really daft question. Well, surely it's the planners or the architects who colour it green on the schemes, isn't it? Answer is no. And we became interested in two aspects of what it is that makes the urban green green. First of all, the co-production of urban ecologies, that is, the intimate relationships between people, animal and plant life that make these spaces green. And secondly, the kinds of vernacular knowledge practices that city inhabitants are the experts in, even if they haven't been, until now, recognised by some of the professional practitioners in conservation and ecological management circles. The image that you can see on the right-hand side there is a scene in Bristol, in inner city Bristol, a city, for those of you who don't know it, in the west of England, just before you, where England joins Wales. And as you can see, there is a cemetery in the foreground at the lower level, and in the background there is a viaduct, and it's one of a whole series of great Victorian railway constructions that was built in the 19th century. The line now is derelict. It hasn't been used, in fact, for over 50 years. And it's part of a network of derelict railway lines. We had major railway closures in the 1960s, and this was one of them. But if we take a different perspective on that railway line, now derelict, this is the top of it. So although it looks like a built structure on which, as it were, we, people who live there, have intervened in an otherwise green space, the cemetery. In fact, the top of the railway line is now a wildlife park. And this gives you one view across it. It's very popular with people who live here for walks, walking to work, taking the dog for a walk, but just as significantly, going to see the badgers and the foxes that live in this space, and the bats and the other kinds of wildlife that inhabit this peculiar inner city neighbourhood. And what became evident to us in doing work in this area is that rather than just green spaces, the designation of this space as a wildlife corridor wasn't the product of somebody drawing a line on a map, although that came in quite late in the day. It was actually a product of dereliction. In other words, before it became valued by the professionals, it became inhabited by all kinds of vegetation and animal life that simply took it over because it was no longer used. As they took it over because it was no longer used and turned it green, and that's what makes urban green spaces green, it's the vegetation and the kinds of vegetal life that can colonise these sorts of apparently incredibly arid, derelict spaces that then drew the local populace to them, the spaces that they actively enjoyed. They enjoyed in part because they were green. One could walk around them and have a sense of being in a different kind of space than the dense city streets that you can see surrounding that space. But more particularly, working with residents in this area, what they enjoyed about them and came to value about them, to the point that they led a political movement to get them designated and protected from development, was precisely the fact that they were inhabited by all kinds of non-human kinds. And it was the presence of other animals and creatures, particularly some of the mammals, but not exclusively so, that made this valued space to the community that lived around it. And after a long battle with planners and conservationists, it became a protected site that is managed by the local community to this day. So this is one example then of where what we're looking at here is the co-production of a green space between people and a whole variety of other living kinds, in turning a fairly arid space into one that's very densely and multiply inhabited. And one account of this kind of work, and particularly some of the sorts of theoretical ideas that underpin it, can be found in this more recent publication from this work on ecological landscapes, and the idea that landscapes, rather than just being the field of vision of people, something that we project, are rather made by our relationships with a whole variety of other living kinds. We turn then to a second example, alternative food networks, which I know some of you are working on. So here we might think of the sorts of more than human approaches that I've described meeting some kind of political concern about the ethics of modern industrial food production. And in particular, the move towards organic and animal welfare foods. Geographers have been prominent amongst others who have been working on these kinds of themes. The idea of an ethically labelled foodstuff implies immediately some kind of an assemblage or network. Markets, by definition, connect producers with consumers. We're all used to those ideas. But certainly work, for example, that John Murdoch, now carried on by Mara Miele at Cardiff University, a whole series of researchers, is exemplary of work in this kind of field. And I'm thinking particularly of the work that they've conducted under 2 European-wide programmes. The project on welfare quality and the more recent project, Dialrel, on the practices of religious slaughter. So if we think about some fairly everyday or commonplace kinds of working assumptions about the connectivity between the bodies of animals and plants that we eat and our own bodily health. The example on the right, which I think is from a McDonald's, anti-McDonald's campaign, gives us a sense that we're all aware of. If I eat such and such, it goes straight to my stomach, thighs, whatever it is, you choose your bit of anatomy. When we know we're eating certain kinds of things, we know that it metabolises and literally transforms our own corporeal identity. But equally, I think that this kind of an account of our that we are what we eat can be exemplified by the work of, for example, an anthropologist like Arjun Appadurai in his book Modernity at Large, where he makes the point that small habits of consumption, typically daily food habits, can perform a percussive role in organising large-scale consumption patterns made up of much more complex orders of repetition and improvisation. And what he's trying to get at there is the idea that whilst food habits seem so everyday that they can't possibly be of any sociological or societal importance or relevance, he's suggesting that in fact alternative food networks, the rise of organics, animal welfare foods and so on and so forth are precisely examples where people's daily habits have been accumulated, so to speak, into a movement, finding others like them who want to eat differently than the standard industrial diet, and who have put their efforts together with producers who want to produce differently to make those connections. So from a percussive kind of role, from a whole series of completely individual activities and habits, to a much more politically forceful role of movements of people trying to make change. But what if we move from that fairly familiar notion of you are what you eat? There is that kind of connection between the bodies of the animals or plants that you eat and your own bodily health, to the rather more complicated set of connections that many of the food scares that came to prominence in Europe in the 1990s in particular, but are still ongoing in some contexts, have given rise to. On the right-hand side, you can see a postcard that was circulating at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival back in the late 90s. In fact, it went through 2 years, early and 2000 as well. That gives you some kind of an idea that rather than of the ways in which the flesh of what it is that we eat, we increasingly are conscious of the ways in which it is anything but natural. So this is a cow with the usual butcher's marks for the names of different cuts of meat. But instead of the different names for cuts of meat, we have a whole series of the sorts of industrial inputs that have been incorporated into the flesh of the industrial cow that gives us our meat. From antibiotics at the top and flavour enhancers, various kinds of salmonella and other sorts of bacterial infections, growth hormones at the bottom, and so on and so forth. So the idea then that this body, rather than something that is, as it were, that we can take for granted as having been the same for all time, is a body that, at least in part, is already of our own making. It's a body that's highly industrialised, it's changed its shape, it can no longer reproduce by normal routes, because we've bred cows to be so large at birth that they can't be given birth to in the normal way, and so on and so forth. And some anxiety that perhaps the things that we're doing to this cow, if we were then to eat the cow, might not be good for us. Now, I come from England, as you know, and perhaps this for us was the one that really brought home these kinds of corporeal connectivities. So-called mad cow disease, which took off in the UK in the 1980s and 1990s. So that we can look at food again, not just as you are what you eat, but in terms of you are what you eat eats too. In other words, there is another layer in this kind of metabolic story of bodily intimacies that eating propels all too readily. So in working with Pierre Stassard, a Belgian sociologist, in fact, who was at that, as I was occupied with so-called mad cow disease, he was occupied by the Belgian beef scare arising from growth hormone residues, the so-called Ben Jonson cow, Ben Jonson beef. This was a kind of an analogy between, I think it was Canadian sprinter who won the gold medal in some Olympics and then had it denied him because he seemed to be taking drugs. There was a similar scandal, this time though, applied to Belgian beef, a particular breed of cow that's highly industrialised, and the growth hormones which exceeded various kinds of statutory thresholds for human safety. And so we wrote a paper together in which we made the following argument: that the stuff of food is a ready messenger of the connectedness and affectivity that transacts risk as a property both of the growing distances between the spaces of production and consumption. How do we know what we eat when we don't live anywhere near the point of production? And the enduring metabolic intimacies between human and non-human bodies. And if we look now at the practices of so-called organics or so-called animal welfare foodstuffs, they all now rely on what used to be pretty much an underground or so-called alternative set of marketing practices. That is to try and build step by step the connections between the conditions and place in which, for example, a cow grew to the slab of meat that you find in your cellophane pack in the supermarket. And to fill in all those gaps, to show the process of production and how it gets to market, and by doing that, to gain consumer confidence in labels that indicated that animals had grown up and been produced and marketed in different ways than the industrial system. So we've come to rely upon labels. In the UK it would be the Soil Association, for example, or Animal Welfare Foods, to tell us that if we buy this foodstuff, we know that most of what's in that cartoon cow on the right-hand side won't be there. We can make effective ethical choices in what we eat. Third example. picking up particularly on that third theme of redistributing expertise. This is the work that Professor Ernste referred to at the start, some very recent work that I've been involved with, quite a large team involving natural and social scientists, but equally importantly, that team working with communities affected by flooding in the UK. A paper that's just come out, I think, in Economy and Society, picks up this theme of the way of bringing together so-called experts, flood scientists, with so-called lay publics, people affected by flooding, to complicate that nice, easy distinction between who's expert and who isn't. And much more importantly, to work together for a period of a year in actually trying to make sense, first of all, of flooding in particular localities, secondly, of why it is that particular policies for flood management prevail by interrogating the science that underpins those policies, and then thirdly, trying out different kinds of alternative solutions to flooding in those localities through these collaborations between scientists and people affected by flooding. And in this work, a great deal of emphasis was placed on the importance of various kinds of things to the way in which we apprehend the problem of flooding. Now, that reliance on things is critical, for example, to the way in which flood science and flood policy relate to one another, and the way in which flood risk management is developed is by commissioning usually some consultants to produce flood models anticipating future flooding in a locality under a whole different variety of scenarios. And then those models that are produced by the consultants are put into a cost-benefit analysis to see which, if any, are the ones that can be used to manage flooding in a particular area. So central then to the development of the official flood management are these models. And models are great shape shifters. One minute they can be a bit of an equation, another minute they can be a piece of computer code, the next minute they're a piece of software, and the next minute they're something in a policy design document that tells you you're going to have or not have a flood wall or some other kind of flood mitigation measure. So thinking with things then became central to the work of our collaborative group, but equally importantly, and we were thinking about how is it that the science translates into the policy in the usual process, it became very clear to us early on that not only did we need to think with things, in our case it was largely maps, but also computer software, we also needed to make something together. In other words, if our ideas and knowledge from our collaboration over 12 months was going to translate itself into the local community, was going to make any difference at all to the way in which floods were managed in the localities in which we worked, then we had to find a way of making our knowledge and our propositions travel. And we did that in the guise of a Bund model. So the name of this collaborative methodology, working with scientists and people affected by flooding in communities in the UK, we gave the name competency groups to that methodology. Unlike focus groups or a whole variety of other sorts of methods that are primarily reliant upon talking things through, citizens' juries are another example that have come to the fore, the emphasis here was very strongly on developing a whole series of knowledge practices or competencies, skills, if you like, within the group that nobody had at the start. And this was very much in line with Isabel Stenger's notion that constantly the experts are asked to proclaim something for people who are affected by the problem at issue. But what we need to spend more time doing, she suggests, is to actually invent apparatuses that enable the people affected by that problem to be party to be involved in the production of the knowledge that influences the policy. So a fairly major step away from conventional practice. In our case, one of our competency groups up in the north of England, in Yorkshire, gave itself the name about halfway through our time working with that group, of the Rydale Flood Research Group. And as I suggested, we, over a period of time, arrived at the idea that small bunds or mini dams right up in the catchment above the town that flooded were both a cost-effective and an environmentally sensitive way of managing flood risk better in this community than the official flood wall that they had been proposed for the town. And after we stopped working, this idea, or what we came to call the Bund model, began to travel of its own accord. This is just on the right, an example, if you like, of its launching, of its being taken out of our hands, a bit like when you write a book, you've no idea what people are going to bring to it as they read it. In a similar kind of way, we put this Bund model out into the local community through a public meeting, and it started to travel, first of all, through the local press. This is just an example of some of the local press coverage of that meeting. And you can tell that we've no longer got control, if we ever did, over this Bund model proposition by some of the language that the local press used, which was almost the diametric opposite of what we might have chosen for ourselves. A team, said the Malton Gazette and Mercury, of top university boffins, that's particularly the term that none of us would have chosen, and local residents have come up with a new solutions to flooding in Pickering. They suggested a series of bunds or mini dams be built on the moors north of the town to hold back water at times of flood. As we speak, through a whole series of complicated enrolments of other actors, other interests, and most importantly of all, other monies, these small bunds that this group suggested, must be 2 years ago now at least, are now being built. So we've just been to visit our first mini bunds in the landscape, made of local wood, like woody debris dams. We're all restraining ourselves from saying, now all we need is a flood, so we can test out whether they work or not, because of course none of us want a flood. So 3 examples then of what we might mean in terms of practice for more than human geographies. So where the post-human can, like all the other posts before it, taken to mean some kind of brave new world. We're no longer structuralist, we're post-structuralist. We're no longer humanist, we're post-humanist. What I wanted to suggest here is that by using the signature of the more than human rather than the post-human, we stuck that kind of rather strange sort of historicity where, I don't know, was it 5 o'clock on a Monday afternoon when structuralism stopped and post-structuralism started, or similarly with post-humanism, and rather to use the notion here that it is in excess of, rather than after being human, that is the critical feature. We can also see that in various ways these kinds of approaches to geography multiply who or what counts as a significant research subject. No longer just people, and the boundaries between the human, the animal and the machinic all start to come into play through the sorts of networks and assemblages or practices of connection of the kind that I've been describing. And we also arrive at the kind of notion that the various ecological assemblages that we inhabit, that make up part of our everyday lives, as well as the sorts of political ecologies that we inhabit, are products of co-fabrication, not just of us amongst ourselves, but they're reliant in various ways on all kinds of material ingredients. As the political theorist Jane Bennett has put it fairly recently, humans are always in composition with non-humanity, never outside of a sticky web of connections or an ecology. And I'll end there. Thank you.